Front and center, men. This is the official podcast of the Center for Syncretic Studies. I'm Tim Kirby in Moscow, and with me, as always, is
Joaquin Flores in Belgrade. Good to see you, Tim.
good to see you as always. And this week, it's your pick. We kind of bounce back between picking topics, and this week's topic is how Western progressives are being used as tools of imperialism. Joaquin, it's a pretty hardcore topic. So, what inspired you to talk about this today? And what exactly are you talking about when you are referring to imperialism? Because it's a little bit of a vague term.
Well, what inspired it is that I'd say that over the past couple of years and more intensely in the last even couple of weeks, the center has received a few requests for interviews from either journalists or researchers from the West, and they want to know more about the work that we're doing. But when I always look at who's asking the questions, and in general, the center's work that we want to be public is published publicly on our website through our public podcasts such as this one, and often in consultation with yourself, ideological director at the center. And so the questions were really for additional information, and while at first it may seem like an innocuous request or an innocent request that one should answer in the spirit of academic or journalistic transparency and openness, the reality is that the questions posed and the requests made were by people connected to the very same interest groups as those who did the hit piece on our respected friend and YouTuber Inessa S. And as people know, they shut down her monetization, and directly the day after one of these hit pieces ran. But the hit piece was approached as a friendly interview, and so I looked at who these people were. First, there was an Italian journalist, and then a Serbian journalist, but living in the United States. And they have been made aware of the work of the center. As you know, our work is pretty well known, especially by people who believe themselves to be our opponents. And what's so very interesting is that while we are, of course, engaged in the pursuit of furthering the areas of human knowledge and in working through the impasse brought about by the wonderments and travesties of technology in the modern era, there are people, because of our opposition to wars, who are very well funded and very important people out of, let's say, the Atlantic Council and related publications such as Vice News, such as the Washington Post, such as the New York Times, and they know what they're doing and they have an agenda. But what they are doing is they are encouraging journalists and researchers who have good intentions, who may themselves be in fact progressives, or feel that they are anti-war, or they are anti whatever ideological systems that they believe lead to war, to actually write hit pieces about us. And so this is what, so that really is, I think, what has in part inspired it, but also I think a pattern we have seen really ever since Tony Blair introduced R2P, what is it, the responsibility to protect, also known as the Chicago Doctrine. And in such, it is such that rather than a first world country, an imperialist power, rather than using the old, let's say, British or Roman reasons for expanding or maintaining empire, they've landed upon new reasons, which are acceptable to progressives and acceptable to the left, which are human rights.
Everything just has a much nicer packaging, like you're saying. Yes, the good old human rights package. That's number one.
Yes, and so it leads to the question: how and why, or how are the interest of imperialism deploying and confusing progressives into attacking anti-imperialists. And I would say that I'm an anti-imperialist and oppose imperialism wherever it rears its ugly head. But as an American, the most that I can do and the most responsibility that I have is to fight American imperialism. And so while I have criticisms of many countries and maybe might think that some other countries are making some mistakes at times or might even question their own motives, invariably if I make those criticisms I can't control where those land and what they lead to. So if I may have a criticism of Russia or of Iran or of North Korea, that's my own assessment. But if I make those criticisms, well, I can't control how people
and you
are.
just mentioned some dishonest journalism. That's what always happens with North Korea, because generally I have more the opinion that things, especially that aren't sort of in my cultural sphere. Someone who lives in Russia, we have Russia proper, some of the countries around Russia that have been part of Russia or have not been part of Russia, back and forth, where it's sort of my cultural space. North Korea is not part of that, and I just do not care. Whatever happens on the Korean Peninsula, that's up to them. I've even noticed recently the whole thing in Kashmir that's going on. I'm not that familiar with it, but I'm starting to see people are trying to take sides. People within Russia and China are in a dispute over Kashmir. Who cares?
Right.
Not
I
our
mean,
business.
Let
it be.
Don't have a lot of
Let it be.
expertise on Korea. I do know that the United States invaded Korea in the early 50s, and I think several million people were killed as a consequence.
Oh, yes, they were. Because that's the one thing, is everyone thinks because the North Koreans are a bit corny with their propaganda, some of the things they say about what America did in the war with them are overblown and ridiculous. But apparently, that's one thing they are telling the truth about to their populace.
Yeah, that's something
a
they
lot of
are.
other things, not so much.
My concern then is that you have to paraphrase Michael Parenti, it's so very noble that these progressives are looking for problems to solve, but it's so very strange that they have to look so far from the United States to find them. And I think that that is really the heart of the matter for me. And I'm looking at how is it through this the nonprofit industrial complex that well-meaning, perhaps naive, perhaps increasingly jaded progressives, and let's say those on the center left, but who might consider themselves very radical or very left on issues of gender, sex, and pretty much almost any criticism of society except for capitalism. Why and how are they being deployed as the foot soldiers? And why is it that they are bent on characterizing our work as being synonymous with or adjacent to the alt-right or the right?
We have to get into the intentions, because the thing is, the intentions of most people who are in the progressive movement are usually very good. The one thing that I think that unites over 90% of humanity is that we want to be good. We all have a desire to be good. The thing is, what's good and what's bad can be a little bit gray and a little bit confusing. And I think that very much so, the progressives have this deep desire to be good, honest, moral people. It's just the results of their path to that goodness aren't very good in the long run. They seem to, the path to being good seems to be hating yourself, wanting humanity to die, viewing animals as superior to humans, seeing humans as some sort of disease on the planet, as if Mars is somehow healthier without us. It's just a very, very, I don't know, dark agenda, but when it's packaged the right way, it seems very noble and very gracious to be sort of on your knees, bowing to other people, sort of like I don't know, the washing of feet, like they mention in the Bible, or like the Pope has done on occasion. I think it's that sort of morality where I'm going to prostrate myself before other people in order to show how noble and wonderful I am, but I don't think that works on a societal level. That's something for weird monks to do on occasion.
What's interesting is the comparison with Christianity or the illusions, and I would say that while I agree with your conclusion, it's actually something very anti-Christian in the sense that at the foundation of Christian ethics or Christian morality is a sense of the imperfection of of humans, and that even in our efforts to do right, we invariably make errors. And so we should always be cautious that when we are criticizing others, if we are in houses made of glass, right? So those who cast stones, right? And what I see a lot happening from progressives is that they actually don't have that fundamental Christian ethos, which I don't think is without, area or space for criticism in its application and interpretation, at least by institutions in history. Certainly, it's been cynically abused and or warped. And I think that there are some good progressive criticisms of institutions claiming to be Christian. But when you really look at what progressives are doing, there is a fundamental assumption that because they believe themselves to be good and they profess themselves to be for the people or good, that, as you said, the results are therefore going to be good. But what I think differentiates them from monks or differentiates them from Christians who not most Christians, but let's say a person who's internalized some element of the real fabric of the Christian trajectory, which is really based in self-humility that these progressives don't have. So they're actually...
Well, they try to portray it. They try to portray it, but I don't know if they have it on the inside. Yes.
They're throwing a lot of stones at other people, and I think that the fundamental sort of Christian thing, when it's done the right way, and I'm not saying that it's mostly done the right way, and there's a lot of problems there, and I don't want to be, quoted out of context, but what they could learn from Christian theology, at least, is that, a lot of the problems that we have are within us. And so when we begin to start trying to solve other people's problems without addressing the problems within ourselves first, the results are going to be messy. So does that make sense?
Yeah, but the thing is, if you ask, because I'll never forget this, it was a particular British woman blogger. She's very pretty. I don't know if she's like a model or something, but she makes kind of interesting videos about her life, this life of very different people. Sometimes I enjoy watching that. But anyways, so she is the exact example of that. She's very, very, super liberal and all that, and she is beyond a doubt completely confident in her liberal way of life, her progressive sort of way of life, and yet she's also made videos about how I fell into depression for 2 years and couldn't come out of it. And because I think in a lot of ways, many progressives are absolutely sure that their house is clean.
Right.
They feel that their way of life is just and correct and in order, but then no one's having kids, everyone is destroying themselves with pills and drugs.
Right.
So it's like kind of when you step back and look at it, you're like, wait, I don't think your house is in order. And again, I don't want to be the pot calling the kettle black. I have not found true enlightenment yet, Joaquin.
Right.
I am not the enlightened next prophet of the Bible. Not even close.
It's the tricky thing is, I guess there's like this Western progressivism being deployed in the service of empire and imperialism. It does have roots. I mean, to clarify, it does have roots in some interpretations of Christianity, but it's those interpretations of Christianity in which the person who claims themselves to be the Christian is above reproach and above being questioned, and that they are the ones who are in the position of judgment, judging others, engaged in witch hunt. So something that I think that these that Western progressives that are being used in service of empire have in common with some Christians or some Christianity is more like the Puritans, the Puritan witch hunts, or the Inquisition, right? So like the Spanish Inquisition. So the Inquisition or the Puritan witch hunts, I think those are strong parallels with what progressives are doing. And when I was, because, when I received this email request from a person calling themselves a researcher from Boston University, they didn't really say that they were on a project authorized by Boston University. And if it really is from Boston University, and if it's really going to be interview questions that meet a certain academic standard, and if we can have a pre-interview contract or agreement that says that I have to sign off on anything that are quotes of me, because they like to sort of truncate quotes or, manipulate them so that they put words in my mouth. I'd be willing to do that, but I don't think that that's the case. I think that they're operating under the color of one thing, but what I really want to get into and what I want to ask you is how is it that, how is it that people are going about this? How do they find these people? Where do they come from? And why are they so willing to throw stones at others? I thought that progressives were in favor of free speech and free, expression and trying to at least...
I think it's so simple that basically for them, this sort of Nazi-like person is so bad that anything can be justified to destroy them. That essentially we're sort of getting into this. Nazis are so bad that Nazi-like behavior is justified to destroy Nazis, but they don't realize that they've sort of then sold their soul to the devil in the process.
Yeah.
I think that that's a lot of it. It's a tribal mentality. Again, sorry, Joaquin, I think in every podcast we've had so far, I've mentioned tribal mentality. Broken record time. But it could be the whole tribal mentality thing where it's our tribe of our values, us versus them. And because a lot of people in the progressive movement don't ever try to stop and step back and think and see their own tribalism, they just don't recognize it. They have the universal truth and they have to defend it, and they don't care what they have to do so. I think that that's a pretty big part of it. I've had a couple hit pieces written about me. I would say, though, for anyone listening, the main tactic of a lot of journalists when they do hit pieces is what they do is they try to call you over and over again, sometimes at odd hours of the night, to ask you exactly the same questions over and over again. And I think what they're trying to do is to find little errors between your answers so they can go, aha, I got him. He said this, then he said this. Now, I dare you to tell a story about something you did 5 years ago to one person on Monday, to another person on Tuesday, another person on Wednesday, and Thursday. There will be differences in that story.
Right.
Even if in your honest heart to heart you're telling the truth, there will always be differences. And that's one of their little things that they do, because people who don't think about that, they believe it. They're like, oh, he said she was wearing a bright red shirt, but then the next time they called, she was wearing an orange shirt. Oh, no.
Right.
And it makes you look like a liar. So that's one of the main tactics they've used against me. Another one is reinterpreting my words. I recently gave an interview to actually a very conservative, very traditional publication, but I started to, because they were talking about the protests in Moscow, and I was trying to talk about how the concept of how there's the monopoly of violence in the state, that basically all states, especially modern states, believe that only they can enact violence, and we got into that, and their interpretation was, you want to kill the protesters. No, I didn't say that, but that's what they published, and well, what are you going to do? We go from a philosophical discussion to a kill 'em discussion. And that's all they don't care. They with them, I think that's pure sloth and unprofessionalism, not so much a hit piece, because they're more ideologically in line with me than other publications. And I think it was just like, this is juicy, someone will click on this. Okay.
Just sort of, just being messy for sensationalism.
Well, yeah, because one of my coworkers at the radio station that I also work at came up to me and was like, why did you say in public that you want the protesters to die? I was like, I didn't say that. What the hell are you talking about? And so he sort of went back in time there. But sorry, I think we're kind of getting a little bit away from our topic here. I love a nice diatribe, so do you. But let me ask you one thing, an important question, big question to you. So how exactly do you think that these people are conducting a form of imperialism?
Well, so what's very interesting is that the targets of their attacks, now let's back up a little bit. So progressives, up until the age of progressives being weaponized or operationalized in service of imperialism, that earlier on, progressives were critical of institutions of power within their own societies. And of course, progressivism has its origins in the West, in first world countries, because it was an outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution, and of course we know that happened in the West, or in first world, so-called first world countries, first. Sort of, it's a circular, ipso facto truth, and by default they evolved there because they were critical of how societies were being operated, and they had legitimate concerns about either the efficiency of society, about the balance between inherited positions of power versus the need for, let's say, more meritocratic positions of power, or they had concerns about the distribution of power in society, that if they were too imbalanced upwardly, that they would neglect, let's say, the rights and the interests of common people, be they small landowners, farmers, industrial workers, and so forth. So at different times and at different places, there were alliances between progressives and labor unions, progressives and syndicates, farm workers unions or farm workers collectives. But progressives also had an interest in orderliness in society, and progressives were also involved in the foundation of other ideologies like fascism and corporatism and so forth. And this is very interesting and kind of gets in depth, but so progressives we think of as being associated with liberalism, which is true because they all came to being in liberal, first world capitalist, liberal market-driven societies that were in some way also had constitutional or cultural commitments to ideas of free speech and the right to assembly and the right to petition government, and progressives generally supported those things. Okay, so how it gets weaponized in service of imperialism is this. So developing countries follow what some in the field of international politics call the developmental model. And the developmental model is basically like, well, yeah, first world countries, they have enough stability and enough of a culture of democracy for enough time, and the vested interests in the contest between the different pillars of society have stabilized enough, and they don't have external threats that are more powerful than they are. So they have this ability to have, let's say, free elections, and newspapers can run columns critical of government policies, right? Mm-hmm. But in countries that are like developing, if you have those same things, then the biggest threat to developing countries is bigger, more powerful countries, right? So,
absolutely.
So what happens then is that so if you have an unrestricted free press, or if you have unregulated free and open elections, what's really going to happen is that non-governmental organizations that are financed and funded by these first world countries will manipulate the democratic processes in these developing countries to get an outcome desirable to the more powerful country. So we'll get a government elected that says, sure, we'll sign the worst possible trade deal for the people of our country that favors this more powerful, bigger country, economically bigger country, right? So,
oh yeah, and we've seen that all over the globe.
All over.
Be it Central America, Latin America, Eastern Europe after the fall of communism. Because one thing people don't realize is that, maybe sometimes if you're used to maybe living in America or England or something, or China, where the nation is a bit more stable and more powerful, if you're in a smaller country, I mean, you have no media of your own.
Right.
Your media is someone else's. Even countries in Europe, like in Hungary, there's virtually nothing made by Hungarians for Hungarians. Their media is translated or otherwise just imported. Their entire entertainment sphere is just imported, which is nuts, but that's the way it is.
That's how it is. And so
no major media.
That's a huge problem for the sovereignty and stability of a developing country, and it actually has an influence on capital accumulation and the distribution of wealth in that society. So even though restrictions on political processes or restrictions on speech that's critical of government or institutions in a developing country, even though it does tend to favor the elites of that country over the elites of more powerful countries, it also tends to keep some or more of the wealth, or capital rather, invested or reinvested in that society, where the people the elites are wealthy are more likely to spend money back in the country, as opposed to going, let's say, to New York to a stock market, stock firm or something like this. That's not to say that elites in developing countries can't invest in the stock markets, and in fact they do, and that's also a big problem. So then the more undemocratic a country gets in the developing world, it tends to be in fact about restricting capital flow from the elites and restricting them to convert currency, or how much money that they're making that they're allowed to keep in offshore accounts and things like this. And so so the question about progressives being operationalized as tools in service of imperialism is that rather than attacking the institutions of inequality or of inefficiency, as did the progressives who branched off in the direction of fascism, so rather than attacking institutions in their society that were either or both inefficient or undemocratic, they take their marching orders from those institutions of their own society to attack similar problems that are occurring in second and third tier countries developmentally, so that to erode the public perception or international reputation and perception, or even internally of the people of those countries, that government. So then it makes it seem like corruption in Tajikistan is much worse than corruption in Germany, right?
Well, yeah. And well, also, it's much worse when the media decides to talk about it, because things that happen often, just like even with these fires that have happened in Russia. Right now, Russia is bad, so fires happening in Russia means it's a reason to sort of blame the government. There are regular wildfires in Russia, which kind of like in California, but no one cares about that because it's fires, it's climate change, it's Russia, it's bad, it's the sort of sum of all fears for a lot of progressives. That's something that they're really latching on to because it sounds nice. But it's the thing is that I don't kind of understand about them is very often their mantra is that we live in a repressive system, often with a patriarchy or some sort of racial hierarchy. There's an evil 1% who dominates over us, but the media tells us the truth about foreign countries and what's happening in them completely. Okay. And the evil politicians who are part of the evil structures of repression, when they tell us to go to war to protect foreign people from themselves, that's also okay. This weird distrustful, yet we're not distrustful, that's something that is very hard for me to understand. Maybe you can enlighten me.
Well, in the words of the philosopher, one of the greatest tragedies in the human experience isn't that people misidentify problems, is that they improperly hierarchize the order, they improperly order the importance of those problems. So what I've noticed in checking out the social media, Twitter, of these journalists and researchers who have contacted the center looking to write what will inevitably be hit pieces, you see. And let me back up and say that even if these journalists or researchers have the intention of doing something fair and balanced and investigative and sort of
but their editors might not.
There you go.
'Cause that's another thing. There's always people might not know that everything that journalists mostly write eventually gets put on the editor's desk, and depending on the publication, they may have actually a very large amount of leeway to change something.
Tremendous.
Including completely removing and deleting the title, putting a title that they want on it, and sending it out. And obviously the title is the most important thing in the Facebook era that we live in,
right,
because you always see the title in your Facebook feed and it hits your subconscious mind.
Yes.
So just something where you can't necessarily blame the journalist if they have a very vile editor. Sorry,
and the thing is that if you look at their tweets and retweets, that all of the publications that they're retweeting are Atlantic Council publications. And so now, I don't want to make a conspiracy here, But let's say the Atlantic Council publications are New York Times, the Washington Post, Vice Magazine, and a few others, right?
Yeah.
And connected to Columbia University and a few other universities. So if all of your retweets are from those publications and you have virtually no retweets from other publications, it's like, so you basically work for the Atlantic Council. But I don't think that these students or these journalists or these researchers really have as sophisticated an understanding of the world to understand that there's a sort of echo chamber of information that they are just repeating and regurgitating, and that
Well, that's more just because people are naive and they don't think that there could ever be another possible worldview. You know, Joaquin, I don't want to sound like, oh, I know everything, I'm such an intellectual, but there's a certain level of development you have to go through in your own mind to be able to accept that there could be multiple different truths that people believe in. And as someone who lives in Russia, Russia has a very different history. Now, when a Western person hears that, they mean, oh, you mean Russians lie about their history because there's only one true history. No, I would see it as that there's a Russian interpretation of the events of human history that is very different. It is a different interpretation. It's an honest interpretation based on its own sort of internal, if you essentially, if you have one article here that says this, this, and this, you write another article, then you base the next thing on the next article. And Russia has that sort of historical foundation of views and materials, which makes it have this different worldview. And like I said, for a lot of people, especially these progressive types, that just means that it's all lies because they possess the only truth. Whereas for me, I think that there's sort of a in-between here. Because as an American here especially, sometimes when you hear things that have been written about America and Russia, you're like, what are you talking about? What? No. Because it's through their filter, their view of truth, their view of history and their own cultural context. And the same thing when America talks about here. Usually I would say it's a little bit worse on the American side, but because a lot of Russians live in America now. But
Right.
still, you'll see it. It's this conflict of worlds. So, again, I think it's something honest. It's in their subconscious.
Yeah.
It's not a conscious thing, but it is a subconscious problem that would be easily solved by a little bit of self-reflection, self-doubt, admitting that we should strive for truth, but we are not little gods that possess the ultimate truth within ourselves, and we can make mistakes and try to hear other people's sides of their opinion, but I don't think that that's going to happen anytime
But
soon.
I think you're really hitting on something powerful there, Tim. I mean, that's really
Yeah.
the essence, I think, of what's going on. I think you've really, really nailed it. I think that's actually what's going on is a lack of introspection and a lack of nuance and this idea of a single truth. And I think that's really what it is, because in my heart of hearts, I want to communicate with journalists. I'm a journalist myself. I want to communicate with researchers. I also happen to be a researcher. So it's like, I want to have these communications because actually, researchers and journalists being able to interact is part of what makes societies function. And the fact that we can't actually communicate because the people that have sent them to talk to me or their editors are going to turn whatever I say into a hit piece,
Yeah.
it's really a problem. And I think that they don't understand that one of the, that what they have is, I'll get to the bottom of it really, what I think is that, like, it's something that you said is that there's a lack of they have an unshaken belief that they are fundamentally right and just absolutely, true in what they're saying and doing. And I don't share that. I mean, of course, I think that the opinions that I'm giving are well thought out, but
Well, yeah.
but I'm not writing hit pieces on people. I'm not trying to end anyone's career. I'm saying, stop dropping bombs on countries that are simply trying to develop. I'm saying stop trying to interfere in the.
Well, Joaquin, I know personally a pretty decent number of people who are in the sort of progressive SJW camp. They honestly want to be good people. I don't think that they're on the path to it, but they do. So that's the thing. I can understand that. I can see, okay, you have this worldview, you think it's good, and for some reason your worldview, although you still talk to me over Facebook and when we meet in public, you seem to like me, but I'm the bad guy in your worldview for some reason. Okay, whatever. But that's the thing about it that's so kind of, frustrating is it's like, I see this, but why can't you see that I also have this worldview? Maybe my worldview to you seems a little bit dangerous or I would say antiquated. But why can't we have a discussion about it? Because even the thing is, I was just about to ask or make a comment that we couldn't have a progressive ever come on this program, like a real hardcore progressive, because they don't want to hear anything we have to say, or they'd seem like a traitor, or it would just be talking points and slogans and all that. And I was going to say we could maybe have a libertarian come on this program, but then again, they're kind of afraid of doing anything with anyone outside of their little Republican-ish realm, because that seems scary and different, and then the progressives and sort of lefties will jump on them and make them look like Nazis, even though obviously we are not.
I mean, something that libertarians share with progressives is that their worldview is formed out of the 18th century understanding of rights and markets and things like that, and but society evolved. But what I think is like very, very weird, and what really bothered me is that, like I said, in my heart I want to communicate with these people. In my heart I want to even have a shot at trying to have a conversation or even engage in the Syncretic method and get them to actually pose some questions to themselves that maybe they haven't. What I didn't appreciate is that, that I'm supposed to be the subject, or you're supposed to be the subject. The center is supposed to be the subject of scrutiny, instead of approaching us as the research institute that we are, and talk to us and maybe ask us for questions and then input those, our findings into their findings. It's actually, they want to make it be that we are advocating things when in fact we're simply analyzing things. And I think that,
well, yeah, or even with our own beliefs. Like, for example, I tend to fall in the sort of traditionalist realm here, where I see that there's value in the experience of our ancestors. The things that were in the past, maybe they weren't perfect, obviously, but there's something there, and we don't need to exclude that. Because like progressives and progress, generally people who believe in progress, everything that's behind the current progress is just garbage. So one thing that would be honest for them is to listen to us, maybe talk about the value of what's happened to our ancestors in the past, and then have them break that down and explain through their filter, their method of reasoning, why that's a bunch of BS. Honest discourse, honest analysis, and without the whole name calling and calling people evil. Just be like, hey guys, this is sort of what they project traditionalism to be, and we as progressives think that that's a completely flawed set of reasoning because A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so on. That's totally normal. Why not do that?
Right.
Why not be reasonable? You can rip people apart and do it respectfully.
Right.
Please do.
So it's
Please do.
So there's this absence there's an absence of a culture or a substrate that allows for free and open discourse, because there's actually a social media campaign to silence people that deviate. Now, what I've noticed now is that on social media, they're allowing sort of more people, a smaller number of people to get more popular, and that might have ideas that are, say, more conservative or more liberal or whatever, that others who don't really understand what's going on might think, oh, well, there's, right-wing voices and there's left-wing voices. But what they don't understand is that what's not allowed on social media are people critical of American military interventionism, which I'm calling imperialism, or economic exploitation imperialism, right? So now you can talk, so now they'll allow, well, sort of a pull yourselves up by the bootstraps or clean your room stuff, right? And they'll call that conservative. But then that person goes on to champion, capitalism and now I think that there are, there's room in there to sort of sneak in some criticisms, but they've already sort of vetted these people. I mean, you can look at Joe Rogan and,
Here, I don't mean to cut you off there, but basically you have liberalism right going against liberalism left.
That's it.
It's not like they're bringing in people from these outer realms of new ideas or old ideas,
That's it. That's what they're doing. And so how they're operationalizing progressives is that they are creating NGOs and research grant structures so that journalists are only receiving awards, or that researchers are only getting their thesis or their dissertation or their research projects approved when they look for those problems in countries that are the targets of U.S. imperialism. So, like, it's in other words, let's say, you have concerns about ecology, but they're only really offering grants and awards to people who want to be critical of China's problems with its, ecology. You see what I'm saying? Or they only want to, if let's say you have your issue is with democracy and human rights. Well, if you want to attack Russia, issues that they may have or may not have with democracy and human rights, well, then you're going to get the grants. But if you're going to attack Germany or you're going to attack the United States, fundamentally attack them, then you're not going to get those grants. If you're going to attack,
I don't know, Joaquin, if you've ever had contact with people who write grants, even at the Ivy League level, but grants are in many ways an addictive substance, because some of these major universities in the United States, I'm talking about the Ivy League, really seriously, the Ivy League, they, want a lot of people who work there to work based on grant funding, which means you constantly have to be writing grants in order to keep your job. The grants, give you your job. But the thing is, well, grants don't have to be approved. It's not like it's not like they invite people in as researchers or professors and just sort of let them do some sort of project that they want. No, they have to write the grant, get the permission and all that. And those grants, I bet, especially now, none of those grants are going to say, well, we should actually give Russia a fair shake. Well, there's some inherent flaws in democracy, and maybe it's actually not the system for the 21st century. Maybe the Chinese system actually could benefit America. No. That's not getting published. That's not getting that grant money.
Not going to get that grant money. And so I'm trying to just understand if now some of these progressives, they're generally young. And so I don't know if it's naivete. I don't know if they've already, drunk the Kool-Aid, as we say, as a reference to, to Jonestown, Jim Jones.
Yeah.
Did they already drink the Kool-Aid, have they already gone too far? Have they already become jaded and cynical? I mean, do they see through the matrix? Do they see the contradictions in this? I mean, look, it's like, see, progressives of the left used to look at the conditions of the downtrodden, and they used to then look at the responsibility that elites had in furthering those problems or benefiting from those problems. You see, and now while conservatives traditionally have looked at people and said, well, look at what you're doing yourselves, and I'm not saying that's not a legitimate thing to do. Everyone must be self-critical and see what they can do to improve their lot through their own efforts or by helping those directly around them. But what progressives of the left did, and I think with some justice and quite well in the earlier, a century ago and maybe even more recently, is they were critical of power structures that harmed regular people. But now what these progressives are doing is, instead of attacking power structures that harm people, they're attacking people in developing countries, or they're attacking power structures in developing countries whose undermining or whose undoing would only be deleterious to the people of those countries. Yeah. Or they're attacking the people of those countries for their backwardsness. So, in other words, you can look at the old British imperial colonizing mentality that they were bringing culture to these people, and maybe that's what progressivism also has this component of. You see, Tim, it's this idea that the empire knows what's better for the savages and the barbarians, right? And so when we attack them and when we take over their governments and put in our governments, then, well, we've got human rights, we've got feminism, we've got democracy, we've got transparency, we've got rule of law, and they just had some dictator. So now we're bringing...
And there's no way that they could have had any of that in their own form or another.
That's the idea, that they're just incapable of or that there are that the societies, that these powerful first world imperialist countries, that they have the best intentions of those people at heart, And so
and what's it called when a certain group of people is incapable of doing something simply because they are the group of people that they are? What's that called, Joaquin? Racism.
Right.
You missed it on there.
Right. It is.
Isn't that a very racist philosophy?
It is.
Isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's because it deprives people of agency and the belief that they themselves can do it, and it's also a form of racism in the sense that it actually goes against the fundamental foundational thing in the Charter of the United Nations, which is the right to the self-determination of peoples. So it's that self-determination of peoples doesn't mean that they all determine in the same direction. It means that they self-determine. That means that they themselves, auto-determination, they're going to go in some other direction with their civilization, with their nation, with their society, with their people, whatever. And it may not be your direction. It may not be in line with your values. The only commitments that you guys have to have with each other is not to wage war on each other, right?
Well, yeah, and especially like as someone going back to a little bit with North Korea, where, the whole thing is, I guess because I was raised in America, the idea of leader worship is not my thing. Like this sort of a demigod, although they're not considered gods, but they're almost on a demigod level with the Kims there over the years. That whole leader worship thing, that's pretty repulsive to me, but it's their business.
Yeah, I see it
It's
as
their
business, and it's sort
that's
of, I mean, they have
that
their
stems from
reasons for it.
Confucianism. You're dealing with something that's arisen because of centuries, more than centuries. It's so long ago. It's so ingrained. It's such a different way of. It's just the way it's going to be. It's sort of like when everyone just wants Russians to all of a sudden just become Westerners. You kind of look like us, just be Western. Well, Russia's history, and Russians over 1,000 years of written history, and then before that, who the hell knows how long Slavic people have been doing one thing or another around these parts. You can't stop or just change that much history. But that is also, you're talking to someone who believes in historical inertia, and historical inertia does not exist generally in, especially American politics.
Well, especially in progressivism, it's all about ignoring. I mean, it's about problematizing the past, and so in other words, that history is only a thing to be overcome. That history is only full of problems. It's not full of examples of things to emulate. It's full of problems of things that we're supposed to avoid because we're going from a barbaric past into a brave new world. So the idea is that we are supposed to be overcoming the past instead of embracing some parts of the past and looking more critically at other parts of the past. I think that would be a more nuanced view, a more honest, at least a more thorough view of the past. But what I find is that what they're doing in particular to get progressives, it's not all progressives. I mean, there are many progressives that are solidly anti-war, but it's the ones that are connected to institutions that rely on grants or journalists that require awards. And I don't know if there's some narcissism involved or some careerism involved. That's what I was saying before, Tim. Like, I'm not sure to what extent they've drank the Kool-Aid, if they become cynical, or if they're just naive, But what I do know is the results of their work. And the result of their work is to further empire. But what they think they're doing is they think they're fighting for human rights. But they don't think they're just fighting for human rights in general. What I find that what they're doing is they're picking people to work on these projects who champion one avenue of how they define human rights that they think can be, let's say, quantifiably established as being superior in a Western country or the United States. So, for example, if they think that the status of the rights of women is better in the United States than in Iran, then what they're picking people to attack Iran on all sorts of issues unrelated to the status of women, but secretly or in their own motivations, their issue is the rights of women. Like, that is their core issue, and God bless them. But that is just what that is what in their hierarchy of identifying the problems in the world. And I think that the unequal or unfair treatment of people based on gender is a problem in the world. But I wouldn't say I would put it here, right at the very top, so that that if you're dropping bombs on that country to achieve that's justified. And I think that when you started off at the top of this hour and you were talking about sort of how they're in a sense kind of like Christians in a way, when I was I have a big heart. It's not maybe as big as others. Maybe it bleeds. Maybe it doesn't bleed as much as others. But my real intention is to want to communicate with these journalists and researchers. And the reason I can't is because they're going to write a hit piece. But what I was thinking about is how they think that they're the good guys, and they're willing to write these hit pieces because they think that we're like the Nazis, you see. And as you said, right? And then I was. But what's funny is that the analogy that I was trying to work out, because I was talking to my wife about this, like, should I respond to this researcher? No, it's going to be a hit piece. We saw what they did dirty to Inessa, and I don't really think it's right, and I don't know if they're aware of what they're doing. But the analogy that I was thinking of is that, like, you see, when the colonization of the Americas was happening by the Spaniards, okay, you had, in the main Spanish cities and in Rome, you had support for what was going on in Mexico and in Latin America at the hands of the conquistadors, And now what was happening in Latin America at the hands of the conquistadors was, the wholesale enslavement of millions of people and the destruction of their indigenous cultures. And besides the destruction of their cultures, was the taking of their lives, the burning of villages, and people were crucified and, disemboweled. I mean, it was a bloodbath that went on for several centuries to crush and to, finally colonize the New World. But what's interesting is that, back in Rome or in Barcelona and Toledo, is that the clergy was like thinking this is a good thing because they're like, well, they're spreading Christianity. And look, Christianity is good because Christianity is based in humility. It's based in submission to God. It's based in the respect for other human beings.
And the savages couldn't possibly have any of these values.
They couldn't imagine that those people had many of these same values, but they believed that the values, like, sort of, it's almost like autism, right? So they believed that the in the abstract, that the values that they were being proclaimed in the name of, that the conquistadors and the church was doing it in the name of, was actually what was the result happening on the ground. And it just wasn't, right? It just simply was not the story on the ground. And I think likewise with progressives today, when they're in, some think tank or university out of Boston or New York or Columbia University, and they think, well, look, if the United States occupies Iraq or Afghanistan or overthrows Gaddafi, that this is good because, look, democracy is because we're going to bring our institutions, and our institutions are based in transparency, human rights, rule of law, fair and free elections, the rights of women and children, etc. So that
it's going to be great after 20 years of suffering and violence. I'll pass.
Right. So that's I think the analogy that fits very well to your opening statement, and I agree with that. And I think that is what's going on. A lot of these progressives are like the clergy in relation to the empire, 500 years ago, because the clergy was behind the expansion of the empire. What was very interesting is that the clergy who actually were, many of the clergy, not all of them, because some of them were very corrupt, but many of the clergy who actually, then went to be involved in the missionary work were aghast. They found themselves in horror and shock at the actual practices of the conquistadors to Christianize, Latin America. And I think that progressives, if they actually made their way to Libya, not escorted with this group of Muslim Brotherhood telling some other story or not, but if they actually went to Iraq, if they actually went to Afghanistan, unescorted by certain translators that are connected to British intelligence agencies, but if they actually were able to have free access to the people, they would find that what has happened is horrible, and they would have a crisis reconciling their own professed progressive values with the actual consequences of the imperialism that they themselves have been promoting through their writing and their work. So I think that is the real disconnect, and I think that is what is going on with how imperialism is operationalizing progressives in service of empire to stop their historic work of criticizing structures of power in their own society and instead turning their fire on people and power structures in developing societies.
Now, to say something on a more positive, so we've talked about a lot of the negatives, the destructive factors, but the way that would actually work better is if people would go back to that whole shining city on a hill kind of concept. Because the best way to really try to win people over to your side is actually to just be glorious. Well, maybe it's not the best way. Brutalizing people does seem to work, unfortunately, but the most moral way would just be to get your own house in order. And a lot of progressives don't seem to notice that the West has a lot of problems.
Well, what you'll find is that the most ardent and most zealous, these progressives being used by American empire, are not people born in the United States. So they're people who are from post-communist countries primarily, and then they are brought, or they are from parts of Southern Europe that might have had maybe more historically what one might call patriarchal systems, and then they're being imported, either telecommuted or literally, brought and given educations in Western universities. And then they're being operationalized to then attack the countries that they come from. So they're saying, so they're taking women from Poland, women from Serbia, women from Italy, so forth, and then they're giving them grants and research grants and journalistic awards to then turn their fire back on those countries, right? What's very interesting about that to me is that there is a lack of self-reflection. Like, don't you think that the country that just bombed you 20 years ago, do you really think that they are doing this, that they've had a change of heart? And this is what it is. You see, the American story is so effective because it is a mythology of conflict. It is a mythology of struggle, a mythology of a struggle for progress. So in other words, they have the same disease that many American progressives have without perhaps some of the knowledge and background of American society. What do I mean by this? Well, if you were to take some of the things that are pretty decent about American society, most of those were fought for by people on the streets in opposition to institutions, okay? But if you were born in another country, and if the American story was presented to you as sort of one thing, if you were told that, it's been these institutions, funded by...
Well, yeah, it's basically walk outside with a sign, stand there long enough, you get everything you want, and that's how change is made.
That's what they're being told, that this is how they are being told that it is progressive ideology and progressive institutions that have made, let's say, some of the things of progressive change which are good in American society. Okay, I think that these so-called good things are overstated and inflated within the American discourse. I think anyone who's even lived in Western Europe knows that those societies are probably better to live in on any number of matrices than American society. But that said, those parts of American society that are decent enough to make some of the life tolerable for some of the people were fought for, blood in the streets, in big labor conflicts in the 19th and early 20th century. Now, progressives supported those, but they didn't lead them, and some progressives opposed them. But many progressives supported these, and many institutions later arose up to study those things, but then those same institutions would take credit for actually having come up with them, or they take credit for having put them forward. So there's a very big difference between the real history of class struggle politics in the United States, which fought for and won some of the things that are worth fighting for or keeping in the United States. So these people are under the impression they're born in Serbia, they're born in Italy, they're born in Poland. They think that it's been, these George Soros or W.M. Keck or Ford Foundation institutions that give money to universities or to journalism awards. They think that it's these institutions that, have been fighting conservatives or something, or the right, to expand the well-being.
Yeah, the billionaires
of the
are fighting for you. Yeah.
It's a complete fictitious story. The real fighting happened on the streets. The real heroes are unsung. The real heroes don't have their names, written on plaques, and there's no awards in their name. So
no foundations.
what they do is they'll put up the imagery of Gandhi, of Martin Luther King, of Maya Angelou. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. They profess, see, the ideology of American imperialism is that, yes, America's not perfect, but look, we're changing in the right direction. And the fact that we're changing in the right direction gives us the moral authority to change other societies in the right direction. So even though, like, the George Bushes and the Donald Trumps and the KKK and nationalism and patriarchy are the bad guys, there's also a good guys of America too that come from liberal institutions. And so long as these liberal institutions are the ones that are involved in regime change operations in other countries, then probably those are things that progressive can and should support. See, that's their thinking. I think that's the secret to the story, is that they're presenting the American story as a conflict between progress and reaction, instead of understanding from a functionalist perspective that it's the whole operation that's being used to control other countries. So it's not just the right, the American eagle, right, attacks with the left wing and the right wing. They think that it's the left wing that's good and the right wing that's bad. You see what I'm saying? But as you said so eloquently, it's the left and right wing of liberalism. But they are completely ignoring the economics of this, Tim. They are only looking at the new left's, issues of gender, sex, intersectional questions, what they call intersectionality. They're ignoring the real economic issues. They'll address an economic issue if they think it's a good way to explain patriarchy. So, for example, they'll say, well, maybe there's some connection. The reason that, machismo is rising, and the reason that patriarchal attitudes or misogynistic attitudes in men are rising, right, is because there's less jobs and less things that men used to have, which traditionally define them as men. So now they're having to go double down on being ultra reactionary and ultra patriarchal, ultra misogynistic, and ultra paternalistic to compensate for the loss of status due to outsourcing, automation, immigration, or the rise of women in the workplace. So this is their narrative. And it's a very destructive and problematic narrative, because it assumes that many things are social constructs, which are not. There's, as we talked about in our other episode, but they're taking progressives who actually only value one thing, their gender or their particular niche of what they think is a progressive value, and then they're using that to justify the whole imperial project.
We're at the hour mark, which means it is time for our final remarks. Mine is really quick. I just want to say about this whole people trying to force change around the world, be it in Yugoslavia in the 90s, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Soviet Union, and so on. Stability is a much more, even boring, bad, unjust stability is much, much better for the present and the future than war and starvation and bombings. Do not buy into this idea that you can bomb people into happiness. It is a fallacy. It's not true. That's all I have to say. What are your final thoughts, please?
I guess I would say in closing is my heartfelt plea to genuine progressives is to look inside yourself. If you have a real curiosity about where hate comes from, if you have a real genuine moral and ethical pursuit in life to understand hate and to stop hate, this is how to understand and to stop hate. Look at the hate in your own heart. So it's really, there isn't as much hate in the world as you think. Begin with the hate inside your heart, because when you put all your love on one gender or one group of people over another, it's that other group of people that experience that absence of love as hate. So I think those would be my closing remarks and my advice to progressives to avoid from being made into fools and basically evil tools of imperialism.
Sounds good to me. Tim Kirby, Joaquin Flores, the Center for Syncretic Studies, dismissed.